In July 1969, a war broke out between two Central American nations, Honduras and El Salvador. The conflict, which lasted just 4 days, became known as the 100-Hour War. Some also call it the Football War, because it was sparked by a World Cup qualifying match. But that's not the full story. To truly understand what caused this war, we need to look deeper into the history and tensions that were already boiling long before the football match kicked off. To understand what actually triggered the war, we need to go back to Central America in the late 1960s. In the 20th century, the United Fruit Company, UFC, owned a vast plantation in Honduras, which focused primarily on growing bananas for export to the United States and Europe. As their possession grew, the UFC realized that local laborers could be important, and they began importing workers from El Salvador. At first, Salvadorans who moved to Honduras worked on farms and plantations without much trouble. But over time, Hondurans grew angry, saying the Salvadorans were taking their land and jobs. By the early 1960s, Salvadorans made up about 10% of Honduras's population. Honduran landowners and farmers didn't want to give up their land, so they pushed the government to pass new laws. These laws would take land away from Salvadoran migrants and give it back to Hondurans. This decision worried El Salvador's government because it meant hundreds of thousands of their citizens in Honduras could suddenly lose their homes and land. The two countries argued back and forth, broke immigration agreements, and tension kept rising. By 1967, El Salvador had already started preparing for a possible war. They strengthened their army and built up weapons. Meanwhile, Honduras's armed forces were far weaker in comparison. The stage was set. All it needed was a spark. The year was 1969, and both countries were drawn against each other in the qualifiers for the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico. So it was now time for them to play against each other in a series of matches. On the 8th of June, 1969, the first match was played in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. The night before the game, Hondurans gathered before the Salvadoran team's hotel, making noise and disturbing them. The next day, Honduras defeated El Salvador 1-0. On the 15th of June, 1969, the second match was played in San Salvador, El Salvador. The Salvadorans defeated Honduras with a 3-0 win. In response to the defeat, Hondurans started terrorizing the Salvadoran settlers. Salvadoran fans in Honduras were harassed and attacked. Homes of Salvadorans in Honduras were burned. What should have been a game of sport became a spark of violence. As a result of these, immigrants started fleeing back to El Salvador. On June 26, 1969, the final game was played in Mexico City and would decide who went to the World Cup. The neutral ground did little to cool the tension. It was a fierce, violent game that went into extra time. El Salvador emerged victorious, winning 3-2 and earning a spot at the World Cup, knocking Honduras out of the tournament. But the cost of that victory went far beyond football. The attack on El Salvador by Honduras increased. This was too much for El Salvadorans to bear, so they therefore declared a war. 2 weeks later, on July 14, 1969, the war that everyone feared became reality. Salvadoran fighter planes bombed targets in Honduras, and ground troops stormed across the border. Civilians fled in panic. Cities that once buzzed with football chants now echoed with gunfire and explosions. The world watched in shock as two nations went from rivals on the pitch to enemies on the battlefield. What followed became known as the Football War, or the 100-Hour War, which was how long the war lasted, making it one of the shortest wars in history. The war was devastating. Thousands of people were killed. Tens of thousands were wounded. Many Salvadoran immigrants were expelled or fled from Honduras, many leaving behind homes and possessions they had built for generations. On July 18, 1969, the Organization of American States, OAS, intervened and enforced a ceasefire. The war ended after 100 hours, but the scars remained for decades. So, did football really cause the war? The truth is, football was only the spark. The real fuel was land inequality, poverty, and political corruption. Honduras was under immense pressure to redistribute land to its own citizens, and Salvadoran migrants became scapegoats. But when football entered the picture, emotions boiled over. The World Cup qualifiers gave both nations a stage to pour their frustrations into pride, anger, and hatred. And when the final whistle blew, those emotions spilled beyond the pitch. Today, the football war of 1969 stands as a reminder of how sport and politics can collide. Football has the power to unite nations, but when mixed with anger and division, it can also tear them apart. This was one of the rare times in history when football was linked to a real war. If you're new here, this is Uyi, where we dive into football history, shocking facts, and untold stories. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.